welcome to this Galleon Foundation webinar on digital health, improving research and care. I'm Jessica Federer, the US Managing Director of Huma, and I have the privilege of welcoming you to today's session. I would first like to thank the Galleon Foundation and Bruno Cohen for fostering this open exchange of ideas to drive scientific innovation in medicine. I am joined today by leading experts in research and care, and we will be discussing the state of digital health. Where are we today? And more importantly, where are we going? My panelists today include Dr. Amy Abernethy, the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the US FDA, Dr. Joy Bhosai, who is the Chief of Digital Health and Strategy at Duke Clinical Research Institute and the Associate Director of the Duke Global Health Innovation Center, Michelle Hoyseth, who is the Chief Data Officer and Corporate Vice President of Medical and Scientific Services at Parexel, and Dr. Hilary Merlone, the Chief Operating Officer of Velo Health and formerly the Chief Regulatory Officer of Sanofi. Welcome, ladies. Now, let's jump right in and start with the current state of affairs. We are speaking today during what is probably the most significant global health event of our lifetime so far. And this international crisis has accelerated our need to use technology. And now in our risk-averse healthcare industry, the paradigm has shifted and it's almost riskier now not to move fast and adopt technology. So my first question to you is this: given where we are in the world today, what technologies do you see as holding the most promise to meaningfully and sustainably improve research and care? Amy, we'll start with you.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me and for hosting this webinar today. Important topic. What technologies do I think are most important? Certainly, we are seeing a number of digital health solutions make a big difference in the context of COVID-19, and I want to highlight two types of solutions. The first is real-world data. What do I mean by real-world data? I mean data that's collected outside of the context of the traditional clinical trial. So information from electronic health records, claims data, information from patient-generated solutions such as patient surveys or biosensors, and information even from social listening such as through social media. And that bevy of information is now helping to tell the total story, the living history of COVID-19, and it's teaching us how that information can fill in the context of clinical trials. The other kind of technology that I think is really meaningful and we're seeing in the context of COVID are technical solutions that allow us to take care of patients where they are. So telehealth, digital sensors such as pulse oxes that are now connected to remote sensing capabilities, et cetera, that really allow the distant care of patients, but the collection of high integrity data sets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Michelle?
Yeah, and I would say to build on Dr. Abernethy's comments, we do have to meet the patient where they are today to be successful. I think it is putting tremendous emphasis on things like electronic informed consent, certainly wearables to collect data, tablets and other sorts of solutions that we might use in, for instance, isolation units or other hospital settings. You know, there is a tremendous leaning in towards these technologies that a year ago we would have, you know, I think about electronic informed consent. Oh no, we can never possibly do that, right? Lo and behold, we can, and we can do it well. But the piece that is really showing up for me is the nimbleness and the flexibility that we have to have with respect to the technologies. They have to fit together they have to support a cohesive workflow still in clinical research. The data, we still have to understand the chain of custody and change controls around the data. And so as we gain experience with these solutions, I think we're at a point now, 7 or so months in the US, longer outside the US, right? Where we're starting to see technologies with better configurability, perhaps with better backends that allow us to kind of clean and manage the data in a more robust or comprehensive way persisting, and some of the ones that are less flexible, that can work with less ease together, that you know, create a situation that in which our clinical research professionals are really juggling a lot of technology as opposed to managing the integrity of the data, start to come away. And I think that's, you know, as we think about how we don't go back, right? And we stay innovative, as innovative in our clinical operations methodologies as we are in the science that supports the drugs and devices we develop. You know, that's the kind of experience we have to gain so we can stay forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving from research, I know, Hillary, this is an area where you've worked most of your career. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I think it's I would agree with Amy's comments and Michelle's, and particularly as we think about the wealth of data that we're able to access now. I think it's really critical to understand the use and the place of artificial intelligence and machine learning in being able to help us understand those data. So we now have, you know, access to, you know, a great deal of human data in, you know, longitudinal databases and data lakes, and instead of using animal models in research to then try and translate targets that we find in animals to humans, and we know that that is actually a really inefficient process. Now we're able to, you know, use, you know, an awful lot of, you know, modeling and approaches to really look at human data and to really understand, you know, targets and do research and develop drugs for humans by looking at human data, which sounds a bit, you know, crazy that we develop drugs for humans, not sort of animals, but the way we've always done it is developing them for animals and try and figure out how we translate them into humans. So I think that's a really critical piece to think then, you know, at the totality of the you know, research and development paradigm, is how do we truly disrupt the old approaches and use technology not just to make our existing process more efficient, but actually completely think about reimagining the process. And maybe we can, you know, we can talk through that a little bit as we go through this conversation. But, you know, I really think we have the tools now to interrogate the data, to be able to, you know, target and engineer and design, you know, drugs for human targets. And then, you know, as we go into the clinical phase of, you know, drug development, we have to really think about how we can, you know, transform and revolutionize that approach. And obviously the FDA have a critical role to play in that.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Hillary. Joy, what are your thoughts?
I agree with what has been said by the panelists earlier, but one thing that I am really excited about, that, I mean, unfortunately COVID has happened, but it has also forced us to deliver both research and care right directly to the patient. But what's really exciting about that is in this process, we've made access to both research and care more equitable. So we're reaching populations that we haven't been able to readily reach before. And I think that's super exciting. And it not only allows our data sets to be more diverse, but more representative of the general population. So really excited about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's also the reason I just joined Huma Health, is also this need to get technology to where it should be in 2020. I mean, if you look at all the great things we can do in 2020, and then you look at the state of our research and the state of our care, it hasn't kept pace. And, you know, now we're deploying remote patient monitoring for governments across, you know, all the hospitals in their countries. And we're getting ready to deploy some of the, you know, largest digital clinical trials that we're going to see as an industry. And it's a little sad, but not surprising that it took something so painful and so devastating to cause this change. But I'm hopeful that maybe we can sustain a lot of the growth. And you all know from your careers, the healthcare change has been so painfully incremental. We take a little step and a little step, and we celebrate every little step, because that's what we get in healthcare. And now we're almost seeing this leapfrogging. So my second question is, you know, given this current state of play, what what do you think, how will the unprecedented scale and speed of where we're at now with platforms reshaping R&D and trial design and treatment process, what can patients and providers expect in terms of impact? What can they see, or what should they expect in terms of impact?
And how would you like to start?
However you'd like, go for it.
Well, I'll start, and then I'm sure that my co-panelists have really important things to follow on. So I want to say some couple quick things. When I think about impact, we're feeling the impact right now for patients and caregivers who are actively involved in clinical trials. But I think that we are also all excited about the possibility that many of these important innovations that we're seeing play out right this second are going to persist. And so my question sort of as a part of this is, how do we make sure that happens so that patients and caregivers can see that into the future? And in order to see that, there's going to be, I think, a couple of things that are required. Number one is we need the discipline to step back either within the middle of the pandemic or very soon after it ends, to say what worked and what didn't. And when I say what worked, two critical things are of question. One is safety of patients participating in clinical trials. Yes. And two is integrity of the data sets that come out of those clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing that we need is familiarity from all sides. Patients and caregivers becoming familiar with what clinical trials look like in this innovative new world, but also regulators, sponsors and industry, and researchers and analytic teams who are used to looking at these data sets.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, so yes, we absolutely have to take care of validity and integrity of our data, right? We have to trust the decisions, that we're able to make the right decisions with respect to safety and efficacy, principally, but even, the impact of therapy, out in the real world, on patients, first and foremost. But the thing that is perhaps, the thing that we have to be also incredibly careful of today is that we don't do that in a cost ad model. So today, in order to leverage the technology or, use, direct extracts from EHR or perhaps pair data with claims, we add new skills to the team, right? We add data scientists or systems architects or, other kinds of people with specialized backgrounds. And inevitably, the upfront design phase is a little bit longer, other sorts of things that have to go on in parallel aren't integrated in the study plan. They're done in an adjunct fashion. So, if we're not careful, the thing that we will leave on the table is the opportunity to develop therapies faster and get them in the hands of patients at a lower cost, right? We can't sustain the RNG trajectory that we're on right now as an industry. And as we leverage everything else that COVID has, allowed us to transform, we have to pull right with it the way that we think about operationalization in teams and skills and timing as well. And then the other thing is, if I could just pick up on a comment that Joy made about more equitable access to clinical trial participation across patient populations. One of the things that's really interesting to me about our current experience is that everything that we have put into play has really been about keeping the studies up and running, very operationally focused. How do we replicate informed consent? If we can't go on site to source stock verify or review source stocks, how else are we going to take care of that? What is surprisingly reflected on in a much lower degree is the impact on the patient. We have an opportunity to be incredibly patient-centric right now and really understand their unmet need and really think about endpoints that matter to them. But that part of the conversation, I think, is overshadowed right now by sort of the operational complexity and that priority, and we can't let that happen.
And actually, Joy, since you're seeing patients right now, I'll go to you. How are you seeing this?
Well, I see it as a really unique opportunity. Like, for instance, here at Duke, we I wouldn't say automatically, but rapidly adopted some additional telehealth services to implement both in the outpatient and inpatient setting. And we're able to connect and continue to communicate with patients who are infected or at risk of infection and keep the lines of communication open while still protecting the patients and our staff. And so that has been really unique in trying to minimize the contact that you need, but in addition to that, keep up with taking care of patients in a remote manner. And that's been really exciting to see, Jess.
Yeah. And Hillary?
Yeah, I think many of the salient points have been touched. I mean, the question, Jess, was what are the patient's expectations? And I think going forward, patients should expect to see many more therapies developed faster, developed more cheaply, because hopefully the probabilities of success are going to be higher. So we're able to have cheaper medicines, and also importantly be able to have, I think, medicines that are more tailored to different patient groups. And I mean, we've seen how in the oncology setting now we're very have developed a great number of drugs based on targets, pathways, genetic expression, very starting to be very tailored to, very specific patient populations. And as we start thinking about moving into neurodegeneration, for example, and I think we will start to be able to see along the lines of oncology, many more tailored drugs for very specific patient subgroups. Because the data will lend itself to helping us understand those patient subgroups and be able to engineer medicines much more quickly to treat them. So I think as we think about the future, for many of us who've been working in the industry for such a long time, if we said, going from a standing start to having a vaccine publicly available within, let's call it 12 months, many of us would have said that was probably impossible. A handful of years ago, and now we've seen it possible. Sorry, I thought I lost the picture there. So, if that is created an expectation for responding to this pandemic, that the industry, regulators, physicians, we can move that fast for diseases such as COVID, then we have to be able to move that fast for other life-threatening diseases going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really sets the bar now that we've all come together and shown what is really the extent of our capabilities as an industry. We have some great questions coming in. Thank you to all of our attendees for these questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience. So please keep them coming. There's a lot of optimism that I hear from all of you, and given your experience in this, again, risk-averse, slow-evolving industry, it's so refreshing to hear this optimism of what you have seen become possible and what you have actually in your roles made possible. And in going about creating that change, particularly in this accelerated environment, but also when things are not as accelerated, what does it take? What is necessary? What is going to be needed for us to maintain the progress, or to maintain the close connections with that, as Joy said, the close connections to the patients at home, or as Michelle said, this really patient-centric, digital, decentralized trial approach. What is it going to take for us to create that as the new status quo? How are we going to institutionalize it together? And also keeping an eye on, the international markets and ex-US. How are we seeing some progress in other countries or other regions that might either be an example for us in making changes in the US, or are there some forefront markets that we can look to that are setting an example that we can either learn from or follow? I know it's a lot of questions in one, but I want to have some discussion on this one.
I'll
Amy,
maybe start briefly.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say very simply, I think the collaboration that we have seen between sponsors, physicians, hospitals, regulators, the collaboration, the sense of urgency has been so clear. The goal has been so crystal clear that everybody has been able to, really reach to band together and really clearly drive to that goal through this, remarkable collaboration across the globe. And, I think that's what we mustn't lose, because clearly with that clear goal and that clear collaboration and the willingness to, and the essential nature of having to try new things, to do things differently, to leverage technology, to leverage different tools that would otherwise have been more slowly adopted. But because of the criticality of COVID and the clear goal and the speed, the collaboration has been remarkable. And we will be letting ourselves and patients down as we go forward if we don't continue that same sense of urgency and that same spirit of collaboration.
That's right. That's really well said, Hillary. I was actually in great points. I was thinking about it. My mind went in a different direction when I first heard the question. I wasn't thinking about it from us as an industry. I actually, my mind went to the patient perspective. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to listen to, there's a patient advocate, she's a motivational speaker. Her name's Stephanie Joho, and she was one of the first patients treated with the PD-1 inhibitors and survived colon cancer that she was, not likely to otherwise survive. But even on YouTube, if you get a chance to listen to her, her story is remarkable and she's incredibly compelling. But one of the things that comes up in her story is that as she transitioned from healthcare to clinical research and then back to healthcare, how broken that was and how much burden there was on the patient. And I would actually say, to hear her, it makes you feel like we're almost barbaric in the amount of burden, having to go to her oncologist to pick up 2 feet of, photocopied records that she had to pay for, right? While she was really down to having weeks left to live, and take them to the principal investigator that enrolled her in the study. And I think about the technologies we're talking about here, and I think about it from the patient's perspective. We can do so much more for them to ease their transition in and out of clinical research, to be part of the process, for there to be better continuity of care, who I was before the study, in the study, after the study. And not only is that appropriate and something we should be, striving for in service to patients, but it would probably also allow us to gain better insights into the performance of these therapies and treatments and make better total care decisions.
Yeah, to follow up on that, Michelle, that's a fantastic point. What I would like to see are further bridges between research and delivery of care on the practice side. That will really help propel and reduce these inefficiencies. Traditionally, some of these have been siloed amongst each other. Sometimes I see, like, a year from now, perhaps we've adopted these amazing tools in research to collect data and ingest real world evidence, but yet sometimes it's not shared with some of the practitioners in the health system. So I think that's one bridge that has to be built to sustain these. The other is, how do we incentivize health systems and providers to continue to foster and adopt these tools? One of the things that has happened among health systems, including Duke, is we adopted them rapidly because of the response of CMS and the ability for us to continue to care for patients and get reimbursed for it. And so I think that's one of the things that would help us to sustain this beyond in the post-COVID era. Another thing that I think that has to happen before we adopt these kinds of things permanently, digital tools, is that we have to understand context to the real world data coming in and what that means to that individual person. So for instance, if you have, let's say, blood pressure values of someone, everyone's baseline differs tremendously, right? And so for some patients, it's really dangerous, and others, you know, that's where they live. And so how do we translate that data that we're ingesting in and put some context around it, and then translate that to information? I think that's probably what's needed for us to sustain this movement.
And, you know, I'm going to follow on from Joy, and starting back to what Hillary said around collaboration, and kind of I want to take a couple of steps here. First of all, to hit on the fact that what I'm about to say comes from actually my prior lives as much as my current life. So prior to coming to FDA, I ran the Center for Learning Healthcare at Duke, and then also as the Chief Medical and Chief Scientific Officer at Flatiron Health, both organizations trying to figure out how do we make substantial change in areas that involve digital health, and what does it take to persist. And through those two roles, as well as what I'm seeing at FDA, I think that there are a couple of key features. Hillary brought up the importance of collaboration, and collaboration in the context of urgency. And I think one of the challenges becomes there will be a point when, hopefully, fingers crossed, you see, the urgency starts to really die down, but yet we need to figure out how to maintain that spirit of collaboration. That's made practical by making sure that we have safe spaces to collaborate. And that's some of what Joy was just saying as well, that you create mechanisms that allow health systems to be at the table, allow industry to be at the table, government, nonprofits, academics, and importantly, the tech industry to be at the table. So safe spaces for collaboration, you know, in my current parlance, that's public-private partnerships. But, you know, practically speaking, that's important. But collaboration doesn't cut it, right? Like that's not going to be all that's required. It actually is collaboration that truly is everybody having a voice at the table, and that takes leadership. That's the kind of leadership that knows how to stimulate equal voices at the table and otherwise fade into the background as those conversations are happening. And so that's going to be an important thing to kind of keep pushing this forward, because what I've seen over and over again is to continue with the innovation, you need the cross-section of all these different important voices. And that's part of what I was hearing from what Joy and Michelle were saying. And so that's going to be important, but then you can't just have leadership that makes sure everybody has a voice. You actually also acknowledge that you have to have the ability to develop lingua franca, the ability to understand what each other is saying. And that's going to be an important thing to have endure post-COVID, is being able to understand each other. And then the last thing, I would go back to one of the things I said a minute ago, which is being able to have tech at the table. Historically, we talk to tech as vendors. We sort of say, here's what I want you to build, as opposed to tech as innovators and thought partners along with us. Here's what we're trying to get to. The reason I left Duke to go to the tech industry was I was trying to figure out, how do I motivate the tech industry to solve problems from what we were trying to do on the healthcare side. And what I realized was there was this huge dividing line between them. And so really making sure that also tech is at the table. And then the last piece, Jessica, you brought up is what about the international space? And I think that the principles are exactly the same, US to US plus, and really whole of world, which is figuring out how do we get the equal voices at the table. There's not, for example, an unequal set of voices between US and ex-US. It just happens to be that's our lens if we're sitting in the United States. But if your lens is sitting in Australia, it's Australia ex-US, ex-Australia, right? So being able to make sure that we have the equal voices at the table. I did my PhD in Australia, and I was really quite surprised to realize how different the lens looks depending on where you are in the world, and the importance of seeing those different elements. That's what's going to help make our current innovations persist, in my opinion.
I just, before we go on to the questions, Jess, I just want to really, you know, emphasize and agree with what Amy just said around truly integrating tech and and not just considering technology as a tool. It has to be an integrated part of the solution. It's not just an isolated tool that we bring in and that we lever to make something a little bit more efficient. Technology gives us the opportunity to reimagine how we should do things. So it's critical that we think about that concept of reimagining the process rather than using tech as an efficiency tool with the existing processes.
Yeah, yes. We don't. Yes, exactly.
Michelle, I know you have some thoughts on this one.
No, it was just bringing me back to, the tech gives us an opportunity to do it differently. We don't lay the tech onto the same old process, right? We can't.
No, and I'm relatively new in my current role, but previously I was Chief Digital Officer for a global pharma company. And what struck me was that creating change is, as you all said, collaboration, but it's also the collaboration just between individuals. We always talk about our companies and private partnerships, but at the end of the day, and maybe it's because I've been interviewing so many new candidates, at the end of the day, a lot of it comes down to that human connection of one person finding another person and developing trust in a relationship to try to bring their organizations together. And it looks from a distance as this institutional structures, and it looks so much bigger, but it really comes down to relationships and to the people in this space. And I think that's the piece that doesn't get enough visibility, is that the collaboration is us getting together and then bringing our organizations together. And so much of it is the people and the talent. And I think we have the people and the talent to continue to push us forward and pull those collaborations. And as hard as it is to get 150-year-old organizations to change, the people have changed and the people already did change. And so the organization is the people, and they are evolving. And so we're seeing this, I have more hope, increasingly more hope now than I did ever before, that we can keep some of the progress that we've made and continue to build on that leapfrogging. And it's probably very fitting, since we're at a Galian Foundation hosted event, which really recognizes this innovation for humanity. How are individuals making a difference for the lives of the world and for humanity? And it's not about one business or one industry or one medicine. It's about what are we doing for humanity to make the world better than we found it, I guess. Before I go too deep down that hole, I think I want to ask just very practically, because all of you here are both visionaries and then incredibly pragmatic and practically minded. I'm going to ask two things. One is, what's the low-hanging fruit that we should just expect to stay, and that we should almost start planning and demand and work towards to keep? What's the low-hanging fruit coming out of this, when we are coming out? What's the low-hanging fruit that we just must hang on to? And then after we talk about that, I'll do the reverse. What's the stretch of what's really optimistic, but we should work towards maintaining and keeping in a post-COVID world? Who would like to start?
I'll start very briefly. I think the low-hanging fruit are wearables, remote data monitoring, telemedicine. I think gone are the days now of expecting to only see your physician by going into their office, and the ability to communicate with a healthcare provider in a more immediate setting, and be able to use all of that remote nature for healthcare. I think that's the low-hanging fruit. That's critical. That should not sort of go away anytime soon. We should really build on that. I think some of the more challenging pieces are a little bit where we touched around earlier. How do we keep up that sense of urgency? Because yes, everyone moved really quickly for COVID, because COVID, many people were unwell and many people were dying. But in a non-COVID setting, many people are unwell and many people are dying of other diseases that have, really, real unmet medical needs. So we have to keep up that sense of urgency, and that is going to be difficult.
I'll go next. I think the low-hanging fruit, the low-hanging fruit is data to answer questions. And I said it in a very specific way. You know, I think one of the things that COVID-19 has taught us is that we have a plethora of questions around us that we don't understand the answers to and that we need to understand better. And historically, we've talked about this concept of real-world data, almost as if the only place we can use real-world data is when it would be otherwise an attempt to substitute for a clinical trial. But in fact, we need to tell the living history of COVID. We need to know not only what the patient experience looks like, but what happens post-COVID. We need to understand how do we plan our clinical trials better. We need to understand what are treatment patterns. We need to try and understand what do benchmark controls look like. And these sort of very practical questions are teaching us that we can use the data around us to describe a huge number of things that will help us make better decisions overall, including designing our clinical trials better.
I'm sort of in that camp. Low-hanging fruit is the way we collect clinical data and develop clinical data sets to support our intended analyses. You know, I think that persists. What I would say, you know, to add a stretch, we develop therapies globally, and our ability to generate those clinical data sets consistently, region over region, isn't there. And so, you know, we're going to have to think about how we quilt it all together. So we are, you know, doing right by patients across the world with the same diagnosis who have the same treatment needs.
Yeah, for me, I guess low-hanging fruit would be that we would maintain the digital tools, the tools that allow us to collect real-world evidence, to continue to foster participation and access, make it convenient for patients to be involved in research. I think that has become a lot easier and will continue to sustain itself. The other piece where I see it as a big stretch is this concept of how do we build and collect tools and share that data amongst each other. I know that, you know, many folks have talked about interoperability until they're sort of blue in the face, but I think that for us, as we continue to build and the infrastructure for this, it's how do we share the data amongst each other so we can truly grow the pie bigger together and accelerate research, is probably something that we should strive for, but probably a bit difficult to achieve with everything, all the tech. So.
Yeah, I would agree on the low-hanging fruit. I see the decentralization because the trend has been there for a long time, moving towards more decentralized care, more decentralized research. And this was a rapid acceleration, and it has so much value to communities of people who either aren't located near healthcare services or are taking care of their families and have childcare or parental responsibilities, and they can't have that commute and keep moving around. And so I think the decentralization would be the low-hanging fruit from my perspective as well. And it is, gosh, in 2020, it seems like such a no-brainer, right? You know, this is what we should expect. Now to reverse it, what's the stretch? What is going to take a lot of us coming together with tight collaboration to actually, what's the stretch reach goal that we should all work towards and can work towards?
So I'm going to be a bit of a fly in the ointment and say that the stretch goal, as I see it, is really making the things that we've just said a reality. And the reason why I say that is, even though these feel like low-hanging fruit, there still is a huge amount of very detailed work that has to be done to translate from it is obvious that this is what we need to do to here's how we know the data sets are credible, that the various actors across the system have confidence in continuing to participate, and we understand continuously what good looks like, as well as the places where we need to improve on it. And the reason that I, sort of see that as a stretch goal is that over and over again, we've had a history of saying, here's what we should do, but we actually don't necessarily do the hard work underneath the hood to make it a reality. And so the stretch goal is to actually really come together and make it a reality. Let me give you two very tactical examples. One is within the context of decentralized remote clinical trials. I said in the very beginning that I thought we were going to have the discipline to make sure that patients are indeed safe and the data sets have integrity after COVID is over. That work, that detailed work of cross-checking patients are safe and being able to have the transparency of where problems are, as well as how things have gone well, is going to be really important to develop the sense of confidence and credibility across the entire space. And until we have that transparency of where the challenges are and how to work through them, people won't necessarily always feel like this is a safe way to go. Similarly, one of the examples that I often think about is tokenization. So the ability to essentially use real-world data to fill in parts of the clinical trial data set long after the trial has ended, or even using real-world data to fill in parts of the clinical trial data set while the clinical trial is going on. Both of those would require and still will require detailed understanding of what's possible as where the gaps are, so that we can have confidence in doing that. And that work doesn't take days to do. It takes weeks, months, years, and lots of people coming together. And so my fly in the ointment is just to make sure that we don't hop over this really critical step and waste this huge opportunity.
Mm-hmm. For jumping on the tokenization, you know, the view of the patient, you know, empowering the patient to direct their data and be more empowered in the whole research process. And tokenization not only allows us to, you know, link data sets and create synthesized data sets, but it is potentially a very important compliance component that allows patients to, you know, withdraw their consent for their data to be used for other research purposes or beyond the protocol itself for which they sign the informed consent. So I agree, but you know, having patients participate, huh?
Yeah, it's a lot of work to be done to get us there, though, Michelle. So important we do that hard work.
I agree.
Joy?
Yeah, I mean, I apologize. I answered the stretch question earlier, but I guess I'll add another one. So one of the stretch goals that I feel like is really important is bringing research opportunities as part of the normal day-to-day operations of caring for patients. I think that is a goal that we could strive for. And you know, I'll tell you a story that happened to a friend of mine recently. Unfortunately, you know, at the age of 38, we went to high school together. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, California, farmland, so really rural. But unfortunately, he was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. And he's still in the area, but had to rely heavily on his initial, you know, his oncology provider, who was not well looped into the clinical trial realm. So the family was left to try to find trials that they could qualify on their own. They were left to their own devices, basically, and then reached out to friends like myself and a few other colleagues to try to help. So I hope that one day, because we are able to share data, collect data remotely, we could provide opportunities as part of the care pathway for patients so that they can participate in research and the burden is alleviated for patients in the long run. So that's something I'm excited for, but I think it's going to take some work.
Mm-hmm. Hillary?
So yeah, I think the concept of clinical research being an integral component of clinical care, if you like, I think is a critical piece to address. I think it's going to be difficult to do, but I would also agree with Amy that there's a lot of hard work to do just to make some of these, you know, low-hanging fruit real, even legislative change perhaps in some cases. So that's the real tough stuff that we've got to be able to really get to, whilst also, you know, keeping that sort of sense of what if we could change this? How can we improve and rethink this process? I mean, you know, if we think about the way in which we do research and development of medicines today, really we're basically using a process that was built in the 1940s or so. So we really have to reimagine how we can think about the process through which we research and develop and discover new drugs and how we make them available. And perhaps the standard paradigm that we've lived with for all those years can be completely transformed through the use of technology and our ability to use data. That's really the you know, the what if goal of the future. But we have to get some of the basics right now too.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. And I think my stretch goal would be if I would love to see technology bring research and care and people all closer together. Instead of us talking about payers and providers and research, and each one has a different system for data collection and a different system for records. And right now we're trying to hobble together solutions that'll auto sync or deduplicate. And, you know, we're trying so hard to get the plumbing right. But if we get the plumbing right, then we get this integrated framework. And I know it's like pie in the sky talk right now because we're struggling so hard with getting the basics right. But if there's no reason with the technology that we have available to us today that's not possible. It's technically feasible, and we all know the reasons. It's not because of the technology that we haven't progressed in healthcare. It's the institutions and the history and the incentives and the time. And I think everyone here has been at the forefront of going against inertia and going against what everyone has always done to do something new. And it takes an incredible amount of energy and time to get us to do something new. And maybe actually I'll just pose that as a question. Is that, what would be some first steps that we could look at to start to use technology as that bridge? We've talked about bridge and collaboration a lot. How can we start to bring the research and care closer together? And have you seen some good examples of that? This is one of the questions that came up from our chats on the audience.
Align on outcomes, patient outcomes, right? So the impact of therapy on the total cost of care and the quality of life, as opposed to, you know, a volume-based system here. And, you know, trying to show, you know, primary safety and efficacy is demonstrated, but then you're switching paradigms into, you know, volume-based healthcare provision and complex, you know, pricing schemes. And ultimately, in the end, you know, outside of the US, looking to demonstrate value over the total cost of care. If we could align from the beginning in development on outcomes, I think it would help.
So I'll give an example of a solution approach that's worked in my several different lives. and that's that it's important, and it follows with what Michelle was saying on aligning on outcomes, having single parts of our work product have value to different stakeholders simultaneously. And let me give you an example. So when I was at Duke, we were building patient-reported outcome solutions where the information being collected through the patient-reported outcomes electronic survey tools would be used directly within the context of taking care of a patient every day, as well as now we're being embedded within the context of clinical trials and outcomes research, so that the same data points had two tasks simultaneously. At FDA, one of the things that we're working on is developing mechanisms so the same data sets and data collection activities can be used in service of FDA-specific tasks, such as post-marketing evaluation, as well as CMS-specific tasks, as asked for by CMS, so that one book of work can then align and make that work more efficient. And then thirdly, FDA, one of the things we've been working on is this concept of an evidence accelerator, where all of the different teams are at the table talking simultaneously, and they're all hearing about how the same book of work can have multiple values to multiple different stakeholders, and they're actually telling each other what that looks like. So that, you know, one way of accelerating is to make the work as efficient and as valuable to as many stakeholders as possible.
And Joy, do you want to add to that one?
Well, definitely. I mean, I agree on all of those points. I would say, how do we build and streamline? I guess to add on that, how do we build and streamline processes so that we aren't doing these one-off projects where, you know, like for instance, at Duke, a sponsor will come tell us the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then we do a data dive to see, like, you know, who might be eligible or not. But how do we build a system that is more proactive, and we don't have to spend a whole lot of time to, you know, dig into the data, but how do we gather it efficiently so that patients are funneled quickly into the trial? I think in the cancer space, they do this really well, but in other areas, other specialties, I think there's a lot of room to improve in that sense.
All right. So we're getting a lot of questions on AI and machine learning. That seems to be, you know, most of the questions we're getting about AI and machine learning. So rather than go through them individually, I think let's address the overall theme of, you know, what is it? Where do you see the most promise for AI and machine learning in improving research and improving care? And I know all of us are going to have an answer on this one. And then what will it take for that those contributions, that value, to become institutionalized?
Why don't I start first and just give you a really quick perspective on AI and machine learning that will then, I think, hit, or I'll tee up Michelle, Hillary, and Joy to sort of talk about the greatest value. So when I think about AI and machine learning, one of the things that I've been working on is how to get my head around how to categorize critical solutions in AI and machine learning for healthcare. And, you know, at the moment, I've got an FDA lens. So I have started to bucket AI and machine learning based solutions into three main categories. There are those solutions that are components of products that we directly regulate. So essentially software as a medical device, for example. And so AI and machine learning based solutions that indeed have already been approved that we regulate, some of which I think will accelerate the process of clinical trials and clinical evaluation. The second bucket, which is most relevant for today's conversation, is what I call FDA adjacent digital health solutions, or AI, where the AI and machine learning component of a solution is not necessarily directly regulated by FDA, but is being used to help develop understanding around a product that is. So for example, AI and machine learning solutions that help to improve curation of real world data, or AI and machine learning solutions incorporated in Bayesian clinical trials models. Those are helping us evaluate medical products like drugs and biologics, but aren't directly regulated by the FDA. And then the third, also really important for this conversation, are AI machine learning solutions that we use in our daily lives. So all of you use solutions in your daily lives, and we do at FDA as well. This third bucket, which is sort of like the administrative bucket, is really important because it helps build familiarity with what is possible and allows us to imagine both what we can use in that, for example, FDA adjacent space, but also what are the potential pitfalls. And so then that way we can start to think about, how do I think about bias in data sets? How do I think about machine learning algorithms that learn and go off the rails, and those kind of concerns. So that's one way to sort of think about this entire space. And then I'll leave it to the rest of my co-panelists to sort of talk about how this now innovates in the clinical trial space.
I would actually turn the question around a little bit and say, you know, where could we not use machine learning and AI? And the answer is nowhere, essentially. As I think about the whole paradigm from research to development to post-marketing surveillance, I can't see any sort of part of of that sort of workflow, if you like, where artificial intelligence, machine learning cannot augment and, you know, deliver greater insights and greater understanding to us. And certainly, you know, there's a great deal of work going on in our company and many others, you know, using AI and ML to really, look at real world data and really look at and start identifying, new and novel disease targets, all the way through to, you know, being able to engineer molecules now based on those targets to, you know, really specifically, you know, deliver those on target efficacy effects that you anticipate and minimize safety effects. You know, lots of predictive tools to help us navigate through research. And then as we get into development as well, I think Amy sort of touched on it. One of the key things, thinking about how we can work to do truly integrated compute and clinical trials. So if you imagine an environment, it seems crazy. And we look back at the past where there's been a lot of money spent and some significant failures, you know, despite the best intentions, you know, particularly in Alzheimer's disease, where, you know, so many clinical trials have been launched and unfortunately have not really given us the type of advancements that sort of disease really needs. But if you think about it, it's sort of not surprising, because we develop a hypothesis and then we launch a clinical study with a patient set, a patient population, and we sort of sit back for 2 years and see what happens. If you can imagine an environment where you're launching a clinical study, but as you are, you know, following the patients, that is informing the compute, that is then informing the conduct of your clinical study further. So rather than sit back for 2 years, sort of passively waiting for the answer, you are actively engineering, obviously with the appropriate, you know, controls and statistical, methods managed, and, you know, but really using compute to understand the patient and to make iterative changes and adaptations as you go. So you give the best possible chance to the patient population and to the drug under study. So I really think those are the types of things that we have to get to now. And we have to really leverage the compute to give us those insights across the board. As I said, I don't see any part of the R&D paradigm that cannot be benefited by, you know, a heavy use of AI and ML.
Similarly, in that, you know, there isn't any place where it cannot bring value and benefit. A slightly different view, though, is what it's doing. So AI is not AI. And so for us, the way it's showing up is the capability. So if you have robotic process automation, we need to be bringing that to bear so we can, you know, improve the time of a task and reduce sort of the manual steps around it, right? Drop the cost of development, clinical development. There's also, you know, risk pattern detection and risk signal based solutions, AI solutions, and those are also critically important to us in terms of adopting better, more informed, more impactful risk methodologies in clinical development. And then the last bucket that tends to show up, you know, for us is the, predictive algorithm type, trying to understand attributes of a responder population, why some patients are responding differently than others, or, do some sort of predictive modeling around outcomes in response to treatment. And so for us, those are three really different types of AI, but they are, to Hillary and Amy's point, spanning the continuum, and each, holding incredible promise to help us, perform differently.
Yeah. I guess I would, coming from the care delivery side as well, what I'm excited about AI is that it improves our access to first, I guess, diagnosing patients and then potentially onboarding them into research later on. So it allows us to get to understand those endpoints a lot faster. I'm working with several innovators in the Global Health Innovation Center at Duke, a lot of them have developed really phenomenal AI tools that are able to take pictures, send them through the AI, black box, if you will, but then provide a diagnosis. And they're doing this on blood films. They're doing this on sputum cultures for tuberculosis and malaria. And there's a lot to learn from the AI that's being built. But what is really fun about deploying these tools in global settings is that we are able to then identify patients that could benefit not only from care, but also participation in trials. So we're getting to those endpoints a lot faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to echo a little bit what you said, Michelle, on the many different applications. Right now we're seeing these technologies being used for something like, a COVID severity risk score. So if you get COVID, how likely are you to have a more difficult time at it? And then on the other end, you're seeing it being used to develop almost these digital biomarkers, which is, taking this continuous stream of data and having a whole other perspective on the person that will help you to monitor their disease progression or to support diagnosis or to improve their care. And I'm hopeful that, I'm hopeful that the changes that we've discussed now during this pandemic, that will bridge the consumer, patient, clinical trial participant, individual view with the institutional view that we have, and really finally bring those together in a way that's not just feeding it into the same EDC or feeding it into a technology that's trying to cobble it together, that will really actually bridge those two and move from the, actually make this decentralized care something real that bridges, that is much more meaningful, and it's more than the sum of its parts, which I know is a hard ask, but we like hard things, otherwise we wouldn't be in this industry. We are coming close to our time, so I have one last question for you, and it's actually more reflective, and it's looking at your career and your experiences, and then looking at this time that we're in, this deeply challenging and rapidly changing time that we've really never seen anything like before. What is your advice to colleagues around the world who are looking to digital health and trying to use digital health as a solution? What is your advice to those individuals that are fighting with us and that are working with us around the world to use digital health to help humanity and to make a bigger difference? So what is your message to them?
Maybe I can start. I think there's two pieces here, but critically, and I've sort of said it a little earlier, we have to sort of embrace the understanding that technology is not a tool. It is a transformation. It is fundamentally disruptive. So we have to be able to understand that we should take on the opportunity to transform the way in which we do things, not just do them the same way with tech. So it's really embrace the opportunity to be bold, to be transformative, and to add that value. In our company, we use a lot of sort of compute and a lot of technology, and one of the visions we've sort of laid out is that we should not do another animal or human experiment unless we have already simulated what we think it's going to show. So it would be, a wonderful world where we are doing, animal or human work as confirmatory to confirm what compute has already shown us and told us that the outcome will be. So, really use technology, to transform how and what we do, not just a tool to make the same process more efficient or faster.
So I'll follow on that. First of all, I love this idea of confirmatory. It's terrific. I would follow on to say my number one piece of advice is to get on with it. So we spend so much time planning, but one of the key aspects of how we integrate technology and new ways of working and new ways of thinking into our space is that we actually implement, we try it out, we develop minimal viable products, and then put it out there and get feedback in continuous cycles. And so the more that we can build in models of working that acknowledge we have to figure out how to make things work and what is the right solution, means that we actually really have to develop MVP and implementation-based thinking. Now that's hard in the context of clinical trials, where traditionally we do massive amounts of planning because you only have one shot to run that trial. And so that means that if we are going to test things out, develop new ways of working, we actually come up with use cases or test environments that allow us really the opportunity to do that critical work so that we can then figure out what to port over into the clinical trial setting as appropriate. So I think that would be my advice.
Yeah, our process follows an agile approach like the tech development, right? Like, let's get there. I'm with you. For me, it's, remembering why we're here, right? Who are we in service to? Why do we do what we do every day? And are we doing it better? There's a lot of, I've said it probably 10 times today, but there's a lot of unmet need. And, you look around to see your loved ones and what they need. And we just need to remember that we're all here in service of them and we need to do it better.
Hear, hear. I definitely agree with that. I think media, if we think about the patient experience and make that our top priority and innovate around that, I think the rest will follow. A couple pieces of advice for some stakeholders out there is that if you are thinking about adopting tools or integrating tools, I think it's wise to choose innovations that foster collaboration among other and outside entities. It's really hard to ingest, read, and write data and then make sure that that is scalable to other projects as well. So that's one. The other is, I see a lot of solutions and vendors just through my work here at Duke and the Innovation Center. And one thing that I would encourage innovators out there is that try to move away from point solutions if possible. It's going to be really hard for patients to adopt just one tool for, like, say, diabetes. If this patient also happens to have heart failure or another chronic condition or hypertension, they're not going to download like 4 or 5 different apps to take care of their health. So I think thinking about how the innovations exist amongst each other is key as well.
Yeah, I think my advice would be, I think Hillary and Amy said it so well with collaboration. And it's not just the organizations or the people, it's also the collaboration, as you said, Joy, with the technology, with the interoperability of, don't just make a solution in a silo for one thing. Look how you can operate in the broader ecosystem that helps the whole person, but then also goes across the whole system. And that's ambitious, absolutely, but we can do it. And actually our patients and our family members, they deserve that. We deserve to look at them as a whole person and to stop funding these, stop embracing these tiny little pieces of a solution that treat just one narrow piece of that person or one narrow piece of the problem. And yes, it's better than nothing, but if that doesn't plug in to the broader picture, we're not advancing. We're spending more of our capital, of our talent, of our people, of our investment into very expensive solutions that aren't, at the end of the day, delivering, that aren't improving lives, that aren't helping people to recover faster, or to find a quicker therapy, or to get back to being with their family or in the workplace sooner. So that collaboration across all the aspects, and of course that goes against a lot of the selfish interests that companies may have, or that individual entrepreneurs may have, or that each organization or country may have. It is a counterintuitive approach, but that's what I think we can realistically expect and almost demand of the technology we have at our fingertips today. And we can get there with all of us together. So we have a few minutes remaining, 5 minutes remaining. And so I want to first thank all of the participants. The Q&A has just been overflowing with great questions, and then in the chat, in the comments, you've been sending a lot of comments, and I want to give the panelists just a last round to share whatever it is that's on your mind, and your closing thoughts.
So Jess, maybe I'll go first to thank you and my fellow panelists for a great conversation over the last hour. I think for me, I don't want to wait until COVID is over to start learning from this COVID experience. I think there is so much that we have learned already that it would be great to find a forum where we can start understanding and incorporating those learnings now, while we're still in the middle of, creating new solutions. We have learned so much collectively, but probably through our own lenses and in our own silos. Would be great to have a forum quickly so we can already start building on what we've learned, and how can we practically implement those changes right now.
And I'll go next. So I absolutely agree with Hillary. And I think that the other thing is that so much progress has been made. And it's important that we continue to maintain what I call responsible progress, which means that we are learning what works and what doesn't in a very thoughtful way. That's part one. Part two is that we are moving towards totality of the evidence, or totality of the information, to understand how medical products, healthcare interventions, and other solutions perform really for all people. And so one of the advantages of pulling these pieces together with digital health and what's happening in the clinical trial space is it actually creates more inclusive information, and we can't lose that part of progress. And then my third part would be that in order to maintain that progress, it's important that we maintain an evidentiary standard. We don't drop our standard. We maintain an expectation that the information that we're gleaning through these solutions as we evaluate medical products and healthcare interventions gives us as much information as possible about safety and effectiveness, and that we are also continuing to understand how those patterns are consistent across time because of the ability to have information to do so. And that's really kind of what I think this entire landscape is all about, in service of patients.
I would say, Amy had brought this up earlier, but just go out and build, but also build in a collaborative way where you're not operating in your own silo and really focused on keeping things close to the vest. I think we can only benefit if we continue to collaborate together and make sure that we keep the lines of communication and partnership open. I think that's what's going to help continue to accelerate things.
Michelle?
So as I think about the statements and the discussion today, a couple of things are standing out. The get on with it. Let's be willing to fail. Just fail quickly and pick ourselves back up and do it again and do it differently. And in order to do that, I think the other thing that is standing out to me is the way that we collaborate. It's hard. We're not used to it, but we can totally do it. And it's, we all need to be cause in the matter. We have to be the ones to schedule the forums and send the messages and, think about whether the conversation we have in City is different from Accelerator, is different from Acro. Why do we have the conversation 3 times? So let's be cause in the matter.
Let's do it. Well, with that, I want to thank all of my esteemed panelists and to thank the Galian Foundation for hosting us. And thank you, all of our participants, for the work that you're doing to advance digital health. It's been a pleasure having you join us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.